A decorated federal agent, badge on his belt, gun on his hip, credentials in his hand, was dragged across asphalt by 4 officers who refused to listen. Not a suspect. Not a criminal. A man who had spent years hunting the very people they were supposed to protect. Later, the most powerful law enforcement agency on American soil walked through the doors of the Harris County Police Department. When they left, nothing would ever be the same. Careers ended. One city faced financial reckoning, and the officer who started it all never saw it coming. This is the story of a Special Agent Marcus Ellison, and it is every bit as brutal as it sounds. The night felt ordinary in Harris County, Georgia. The kind of evening that slips into the calendar without notice. The air smelled like rain that had not yet fallen. The streets around the Westbrook Warehouse District were mostly quiet, broken only by the occasional rumble of a freight truck grinding through its gears on Route 9. Special Agent Marcus Ellison had been awake for a long stretch. He sat in a rented Chevy Silverado, deliberately chosen to look like the kind of truck a drug buyer might drive, parked at the edge of a gravel lot behind a defunct auto parts warehouse. His phone rested on his thigh, screen dimmed to the lowest setting. On the seat beside him sat a worn leather jacket, a half-eaten granola bar, and a federal surveillance file marked with the bold red stamp, Operation Ironclad. Marcus was a graduate of Howard University and the FBI Academy at Quantico. He had spent more than a decade embedded in some of the most dangerous criminal networks operating in the American South. He had broken the Castellano drug pipeline out of Miami. He had infiltrated a white-collar arms trafficking ring in Birmingham. He had testified before federal grand juries multiple times and never lost a single case. That night, he was close to closing the biggest operation of his career. The Westbrook Cartel, a loosely affiliated network of mid-level drug distributors operating across 6 Georgia counties, had been under FBI surveillance for some time. Marcus had spent the last stretch undercover, working his way into the confidence of a man named Troy Maddox, a former Army logistics officer who now ran distribution out of 4 seemingly legitimate small businesses. The buy that would flip Troy was scheduled soon. Marcus just needed to surveil one final handoff to confirm the location of a secondary warehouse where the FBI believed the bulk of the cartel's product was being staged. He was alone in the car because that was the protocol. No backup visible, no markings, nothing to spook the subjects. A Harris County police cruiser rolled slowly through the parking lot. Marcus noticed it but did not react. He was used to patrol officers circling areas like this. He kept his eyes on the warehouse loading dock, one hand resting casually on his knee. The cruiser stopped, then reversed. Its spotlight snapped on, flooding the cab of the Silverado with blinding white light. Marcus exhaled slowly through his nose. He understood what this looked like. A black man alone in a truck in an industrial district after dark. He had dealt with this kind of stop before. He knew the procedure. He placed both hands on the steering wheel, visible and still, and waited. Officer Caleb Harlan stepped out of the cruiser. He was in his late 20s, several years on the force, with a square jaw and the confident stride of a man who had never once questioned whether he might be wrong about something. Behind him, his partner, Officer Logan Sterling, exited the passenger side and moved to position himself behind the truck. Harlan approached the driver's window with his hand resting on his holster. "Sir, roll down the window. Step out of the vehicle." Marcus rolled down his window. He did not step out. Instead, very slowly and deliberately, he spoke first. "Officer, I need to inform you that I am a federal law enforcement agent. I'm going to reach into my jacket and show you my credentials. Please do not be alarmed." There was a pause. Harlan's eyes narrowed. "I said step out of the vehicle. Now. Step out now." Marcus kept his voice measured. "I am Special Agent Marcus Ellison with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I am on an active surveillance operation in this area. I need you to call your supervisor before the situation escalates." Harlan glanced back at Sterling. Something passed between them. Not caution, not uncertainty. Something closer to irritation. The irritation of a man who does not like to be corrected by the person he has already decided is subordinate to him. "Get out of the vehicle," Harlan said again, louder this time. "Last warning." Marcus slowly reached for his jacket pocket. "I'm reaching for my credentials. Hands now." Harlan drew his weapon. Everything that happened next took less than a minute. Marcus Ellison was pulled from the Silverado with his hands up, his FBI badge and credentials in plain sight, still speaking calmly to two officers who had already made up their minds. "I'm a federal agent. My badge number is—" "Shut up. Hands behind your back. My supervising agent is Riley Trenton. Her number is in my phone. Please call her. You don't comply. We add resisting to the charge." "What charge? What am I being charged with?" Nobody answered that question. Not then. Not for the next stretch of time. Officer Sterling found the surveillance file on the seat. He held it up. The red Operation Ironclad stamp was clearly visible. He showed it to Harlan. A reasonable person at that moment would have stopped, would have taken a breath and said, "Wait, let's think about this." Harlan was not a reasonable person that night. "Could be anything," he said. "Book him." Marcus was handcuffed and placed in the back of the police cruiser. His phone, his direct link to the FBI field office in Atlanta, was placed in an evidence bag. His badge, his credentials, his weapon, his surveillance file, all of it bagged and tagged and locked in a patrol vehicle trunk. The charge eventually scrolled onto the intake form at Harris County P.D. Read, "Suspicious activity, failure to comply, trespassing." He was not on private property. The parking lot was public access. Sergeant Nolan Greer was the watch supervisor that night, a man close to retirement who had spent the last stretch in the comfortable fog of administrative routine. When Harlan radioed in the arrest, Greer asked two questions. "Is he armed?" "Yes." "Is he in custody?" "Yes." Then he approved the booking without asking a single follow-up question. Not about the badge, not about the credentials, not about the federal documents sitting in the evidence bag. Special Agent Marcus Ellison was processed into the Harris County Detention Facility and placed in a holding cell. Officer Logan Sterling went back to the Silverado, found a secondary phone Marcus used for undercover work, and turned off the FBI tracking beacon attached to the vehicle's undercarriage, though he would later claim he had simply moved the vehicle and not known what the device was. The clock started. The holding cell smelled like industrial cleaner and old fear. There were 4 other men in it. 2 who appeared to be intoxicated, 1 who was clearly in medical distress and wasn't receiving attention, and 1 who sat perfectly still in the corner and said nothing. Marcus sat on the metal bench, his back straight, his mind running through everything he knew. He had the right to a phone call. He knew that. What he didn't know, what he had no way of knowing, was that the desk officer processing him had logged his request for a phone call, looked at the name on the booking form, looked at the clock, and decided it could wait until the shift supervisor gave the say-so. That supervisor was Sergeant Greer, who was currently eating a sandwich in his office and watching a college basketball replay. Marcus asked multiple times over the course of the first stretch to speak to someone, anyone in authority. The officer who appeared at the cell door each time gave the same answer. "Someone will be with you shortly." No one came. Meanwhile, miles away in the Westbrook Warehouse District, the handoff Marcus had spent months positioning himself to witness was taking place without him. Troy Maddox received the shipment, signed off on it with the kind of casual confidence that comes from knowing the coast is clear, and drove away. The secondary warehouse location, the one piece of the puzzle the FBI needed, remained unknown. Operation Ironclad was compromised. Inside the cell, Marcus did not panic. He was trained not to panic. But as the hours accumulated, a cold, methodical anger began to replace the professional calm. The next time an officer came to the cell door, he would not ask politely. He would state clearly and for the record exactly who he was and what the consequences of this detention would be. He would be specific. He would be precise. He would give them one final opportunity to correct a mistake that was still technically correctable. Officer Karen Bledsoe appeared at the cell for a routine welfare check. She looked through the bars at the man on the bench, a man who looked nothing like the other occupants of the cell, a man sitting with the composed stillness of someone who had been trained to wait. "You need anything?" she asked. "Yes," Marcus said. "I need you to call the Atlanta field office of the FBI. The number is there. Tell them that Special Agent Marcus Ellison has been detained at this facility and request that they contact Deputy Director Jamal Okoro immediately. Can you do that?" Bledsoe blinked. "I'll pass the message along. I need you to make the call yourself right now from this hallway. I'll wait." Something in his voice, the absolute certainty of it, the absence of desperation or bluster, made her pause. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she walked back down the hallway, found Sergeant Greer, and repeated what the man in the cell had told her. Greer chewed his sandwich. If he were FBI, they'd have already called looking for him. He says his phone was taken as evidence. Then he'll get his call in the morning. Bledsoe went back to her rounds, but she didn't forget the conversation. And later, much later, she would be the one person in Harriet County PD who would not face termination. Because unlike everyone else in that building that night, she had at least tried. Captain Vance Whitaker arrived at the station for an early shift. Whitaker was a veteran, the kind of man who used phrases like "by the book" and "chain of command" as shields against having to think independently. When Greer briefed him on the arrest, including the fact that the suspect had claimed to be a federal agent, Whitaker's response was telling. "He say anything else? Keeps asking for a phone call. What are the charges?" "Suspicious activity, failure to comply, trespassing." Whitaker nodded. "Hold him till morning. We'll sort it out in daylight." 6 words that would eventually cost Vance Whitaker his pension, his reputation, and very nearly his freedom. Marcus Ellison had been in custody for hours. Back at the FBI field office in Atlanta, Special Agent Riley Trenton, Marcus's supervising agent, and the person listed as his emergency contact in the Bureau's internal system, had arrived early for a briefing on Operation Ironclad. She was expecting a check-in from Marcus, who had been scheduled to call with surveillance notes. No call had come. She tried his phone, voicemail. She tried his undercover phone. Nothing. She pinged the tracking beacon on the Silverado. It returned no signal. Riley Trenton had worked alongside Marcus Ellison for years. She knew his habits, his protocols, his discipline. The man didn't miss check-ins. Not ever. She called Deputy Director Jamal Okoro at home. Jamal Okoro was a second-generation Nigerian-American who had grown up in Columbus, Ohio, attended Yale Law, spent decades climbing the FBI ladder, and now served as the deputy director of the Atlanta field office, which oversaw federal operations across 4 southeastern states. He was also a man known among those who knew him well for a particular quality. Once he decided something needed to be done, nothing in the world moved faster than his execution of it. He picked up on the second ring. "Tell me," he said. Riley told him. Soon after, 3 FBI vehicles were on their way to Harriet County. They didn't use sirens. That was the detail people would remember later. Those who were there. Those who saw it happen. 3 black SUVs rolling through the pre-dawn streets of Harriet County, Georgia, without a sound. Just lights and purpose. Deputy Director Jamal Okoro walked through the front door of the Harriet County Police Department. Behind him were 8 federal agents, 3 of whom carried what would later be described in departmental records as a significant volume of legal documentation. The desk officer, a man named Gary Prout, who had been working the overnight shift for years and had seen nothing remotely like this, rose from his chair and opened his mouth. Okoro did not slow down. "Where is Special Agent Marcus Ellison?" It was not a question. It had the grammar of a question, but the weight of an ultimatum. Gary Prout, to his credit, answered immediately. "Cell Block B, sir." "Sir, who are—" Okoro held up his credentials without breaking stride. The FBI found Captain Vance Whitaker in his office, coffee in hand, reviewing a patrol schedule. When the door opened and he saw Okoro, 6 feet tall, immaculate in a charcoal suit, radiating the specific kind of controlled fury that comes from a man who has learned to weaponize his composure, Whitaker set the coffee down slowly, very slowly. "Captain Whitaker," Okoro said, "you are currently holding a federal law enforcement officer in one of your cells. You have been holding him for hours. He is on an active undercover operation that your officers have now compromised. I'm going to need you to release him immediately, and then I'm going to need you to sit in that chair and not make any phone calls. Do you understand me?" Whitaker's mouth moved. No sound came out. "Captain?" "Yes," Whitaker said. "Yes, I understand." Marcus Ellison was released from the cell. He walked out of the cell block into the hallway and stopped when he saw Okoro. The two men looked at each other for a moment. Marcus still in the clothes he had been wearing during surveillance, his jaw tight, his eyes carrying the particular kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with sleep. "You all right?" Okoro asked. "No," Marcus said. "Not even a little bit." Okoro nodded. "Good. I need you honest today." He placed a hand briefly on Marcus's shoulder. "Your operation, is it salvageable?" Marcus thought about Troy Maddox driving away, about the handoff he had missed, about months of work. "Not in its current form," he said. The word that Okoro used in response is not one that appears in the official record, but everyone in the hallway heard it. By morning, Harrow County Police Chief Brock Donnelly had been woken by a call from Captain Whitaker. The story Whitaker told him was already beginning to compress and reshape itself, the way stories do when the people telling them are frightened. Whitaker's version: 2 officers had responded to a suspicious vehicle call. The occupant had been uncooperative. The arrest had followed standard protocol. Nobody had known he was FBI. An honest mistake. Chief Brock Donnelly, a portly man in his early 60s who had run Harrow County PD for years, largely by avoiding controversy, arrived at the station to find it already swarming with federal agents. He was met in the parking lot by Special Agent Riley Trenton, who handed him a single sheet of paper. It was a timeline, minute by minute, reconstructed from cell tower data, the booking system's internal logs, surveillance footage from inside the facility, and the radio dispatch records. Donnelly read it. His face went slowly from pink to gray. "The body cams," he said. "From the arresting officers. We've already requested them," Trenton said pleasantly. "Both cameras were off during the arrest." There was a pause. "Both of them," Donnelly repeated. "Both of them simultaneously," which is coincidentally exactly minutes after Officer Harlan spotted the vehicle in the parking lot and radioed his partner. This was not a coincidence. Under Harrow County PD policy written, signed, and distributed by Brock Donnelly himself, body cameras were required to be activated during any field contact with a civilian. The deactivation of 2 cameras at the same moment, minutes before an arrest, was not an equipment malfunction. It was a decision. What no one in the Harrow County PD had accounted for, what Caleb Harlan and Logan Sterling had specifically not accounted for, was the parking lot across the street from the warehouse. It belonged to a cold storage logistics company called Southern Cross Refrigeration. Southern Cross had upgraded its exterior security system months earlier, installing 4 high-definition cameras with a field of view that extended well beyond their own property line. The cameras were motion-activated and stored days of footage on a private server. FBI forensic technicians pulled the footage soon after. What they found was comprehensive, unambiguous, and devastating. The footage showed Marcus Ellison's hands raised the entire time. It showed him speaking calmly, clearly to both officers. It showed him reaching slowly, with explicit verbal warning for his jacket pocket. It showed Officer Harlan looking directly at the FBI credentials in Marcus's hand, not glancing, not glimpsing, looking for full seconds. And then it showed Harlan turning to Sterling with a particular expression, an expression that would be described by 2 separate behavioral analysts in subsequent proceedings as contempt. Before saying something that the camera's audio partially captured by the upgraded microphones preserved as 2 words, "Doesn't matter." Those 2 words became the center of gravity around which everything else collapsed. Soon after, FBI forensic accountant Dana Crowell, brought in by Okoro's team, began pulling Harrow County PD personnel records. What she found over the next stretch would expand the scope of the investigation far beyond one bad arrest on one night. Caleb Harlan had multiple prior complaints filed against him. All had been reviewed by Sergeant Nolan Greer. All had been dismissed with a notation: "Officer exercised appropriate judgment given field conditions." Logan Sterling had complaints. Same reviewer, same notation. Over recent years, officers in Harrow County PD had accumulated complaints that had been reviewed and dismissed by one of 3 supervisors: Greer, a lieutenant named Carl Weiss, and Captain Vance Whitaker himself. The complaints, when Crowell laid them out chronologically and demographically, formed a pattern that required no statistical expertise to interpret. Of the complaints filed over the period involving use of excessive force or unlawful detention, the vast majority involved Black or Latino residents. Of those, 0 had resulted in disciplinary action. 0. The Marcus Ellison arrest was not an aberration. It was the system functioning exactly as it had been allowed to function. Soon after, Harriff County Mayor Reginald Finch arrived at the police station. He was accompanied by the city's senior attorney, a meticulous man in his late 50s who had handled municipal legal affairs for years and had a gift for reading rooms. The attorney took one look at the number of federal agents, the volume of files being copied, and the expression on Deputy Director Jamal Okoro's face, and leaned toward Mayor Finch. "Reginald," he said quietly, "we're going to need to talk about settlement figures." Finch, who had spent the previous stretch campaigning for a road resurfacing bond, looked at him blankly. "What kind of figures?" The attorney didn't answer right away. He was doing mental arithmetic, the kind that involves jury verdicts and federal civil rights statutes, and the going rate for high-profile wrongful detention cases with documented racial bias, compromised undercover operations, and Southern Cross refrigeration camera footage. Large ones. The FBI's formal referral to the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division arrived days after the arrest. The referral was lengthy, meticulously footnoted, and attached to it as appendices were the Southern Cross refrigeration footage, the reconstructed timeline, Dana Crowell's complaint pattern analysis, the audio capture of "Doesn't Matter," and a sworn affidavit from Special Agent Marcus Ellison that ran to pages and read, according to a federal judge who would later review it, with the precision of a prosecutorial brief, because Marcus had written every word of it himself, working through nights, channeling the hours in that cell into pages of documented, sequenced, legally structured account. The DOJ investigation ran parallel to an internal affairs review conducted by Georgia's Peace Officer Standards and Training Council, which had been contacted by Okoro's office the morning of the arrest. The investigator assigned to the case was a woman named Sandra Ellison, a former Fulton County detective who had spent years investigating officer misconduct and had a reputation for thoroughness that her colleagues described variously as admirable or terrifying, depending on which side of her desk they sat on. Sandra Ellison spent days in Harriff County. She interviewed dozens of people. She pulled every document the department had generated in recent years. She attended city council sessions and sat in the back of the room taking notes with the quiet focus of someone who already knows what they're looking for and is simply building the path to it. During her investigation, she found something that had nothing to do with Marcus Ellison. Buried in a batch of evidence room logs, Sandra found a discrepancy. Cases in which items listed as seized evidence had no corresponding disposition records. The evidence had been logged in. It had never been logged out. But in cases, the criminal charges had been quietly dropped. She pulled the arresting officer reports for all cases. Several of them were signed by Caleb Harlan. When Sandra Ellison brought this to Captain Vance Whitaker, he told her it was a clerical error. When she brought it to Chief Brock Donnelly, he told her it was an ongoing internal matter. When she brought it to Deputy Director Jamal Okoro, he picked up his phone and called the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Georgia, a woman named Patricia Walden, who cleared her afternoon schedule and asked Okoro to have Sandra Ellison in her office soon after. Caleb Harlan, it emerged, had been skimming seized drug evidence. Small amounts. Enough to sell, not enough to obviously flag. He'd been doing it for years. Sergeant Nolan Greer had, the evidence would eventually suggest, known about it and had used that knowledge to ensure Harlan's complaints were always dismissed. Because a Harlan who feared Greer was a Harlan who stayed quiet about Greer's own secondary income. A protection arrangement with two local businesses that allowed them to avoid noise ordinance enforcement in exchange for monthly cash payments. The thread, once pulled, unraveled faster than anyone anticipated. Lieutenant Carl Weiss had falsified overtime records over months. Captain Vance Whitaker had approved a no-bid contract for police vehicle maintenance to a company owned by his brother-in-law. 3 other officers had used department databases to run unauthorized searches on private citizens, in 2 cases on individuals involved in personal disputes with the officers. The arrest of Marcus Ellison had not been the beginning of the rot. It had been the moment someone shone a light on a rot that had been spreading quietly for years. The termination proceedings began soon after. Officer Caleb Harlan, terminated, criminally charged with evidence tampering, civil rights violations under federal statute, and theft of government property. Bail set high. Officer Logan Sterling, terminated, criminally charged with civil rights violations and obstruction of justice for disabling the beacon. Bail set accordingly. Sergeant Nolan Greer, terminated, criminally charged with conspiracy, evidence tampering, and corruption. Bail set higher. Lieutenant Carl Weiss, terminated, criminally charged with fraud and falsification of records. Captain Vance Whitaker, terminated, under investigation for corruption and contracting fraud. Criminal charges pending. Chief Brock Donnelly, forced resignation. No criminal charges, but no pension either, following a determination by the city that his failure to investigate prior complaints constituted a breach of his employment contract. Officer Karen Bledsoe, the one who had tried, was not only cleared, but promoted. Additional officers received disciplinary actions ranging from suspension to demotion based on findings related to the complaint suppression pattern and the database misuse. 17 badges total gone. And it wasn't done yet. Attorney Reginald Ashworth had seen the settlement number coming from the moment he walked into that police station on the morning after the arrest. What he hadn't fully accounted for was the multiplier effect. The way a single case, when it cracks open correctly, doesn't stay a single case. Marcus Ellison retained a private attorney within hours of his release. A woman named Elena Webb, a civil rights litigator based in Atlanta, who had won multiple landmark wrongful arrest cases and was known in Georgia legal circles for a willingness to push every case to trial rather than accept a quiet settlement, because she understood, as she once told an interviewer, that quiet settlements are what cities use to buy silence. Elena Webb filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against Harrah County on behalf of Marcus Ellison soon after. The lawsuit named the county, the city, Chief Donnelly, Captain Whitaker, Officer Harlan, and Officer Sterling as defendants. It alleged violations of the Fourth Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, and the federal civil rights statutes, including a specific claim under federal code and a Bivens-adjacent theory that applied to the systemic nature of the misconduct. The prayer for relief sought millions. The city, on the advice of every lawyer in its orbit, immediately signaled willingness to negotiate. What followed were weeks of negotiation that Reginald Ashworth later described, in a moment of unusual candor at a Georgia Bar Association dinner, as the most humbling experience of his professional life. Every time the city came to the table with a number, Elena Webb thanked them politely and laid another piece of evidence on the table: the Southern Cross footage, the complaint pattern analysis, the evidence room discrepancies, the audio clip of "Doesn't Matter," and then, weeks into negotiations, a development that no one had anticipated. Other individuals came forward, not FBI agents, not lawyers, not people with Elena Webb's resources or Marcus Ellison's institutional backing. Residents of Harrah County, black men and women ranging in age, who had experienced wrongful arrests, unlawful detentions, or excessive force at the hands of Harrah County PD over recent years. People who had filed complaints and been dismissed. People who had never filed complaints because they hadn't believed anyone would listen. People who had seen the news coverage of the Ellison case, because by then it was everywhere, and recognized in it the shape of something that had happened to them. Elena Webb, with Marcus Ellison's explicit blessing and active encouragement, absorbed additional cases into an amended complaint. The others retained separate counsel. By the time the consolidated lawsuit was filed in federal court, it represented multiple plaintiffs with documented, corroborated claims against the same systemic pattern of misconduct. The city's exposure increased dramatically. Mayor Reginald Finch, who had been up for re-election, called a press conference. He read a prepared statement about accountability and reform, and the city's commitment to justice. When a reporter asked him why it had taken a federal agent being arrested for the city to look at its own police department, Finch paused for a long time before saying that he deeply regretted the gaps in oversight that had allowed the situation to develop. The reporter's follow-up question, "Were you aware of the complaint suppression pattern prior to this investigation?" was met with a response from Finch's communications director that the mayor would take no further questions. Reginald Finch lost his re-election bid by points. His opponent ran on a single-issue platform, police accountability. She won every precinct in the city except one. Settlement negotiations concluded soon after. Harrogate County agreed to pay millions, distributed as follows: millions to Marcus Ellison for wrongful arrest, civil rights violations, and the documented compromise of Operation Ironclad, millions to the additional plaintiffs whose cases were consolidated into the amended complaint, plus a non-financial settlement package that included mandatory department-wide retraining, the installation of body camera accountability software that flagged any deactivation outside designated zones, independent oversight of the complaint review process for years, and a formal written apology signed by the acting police chief, the city attorney, and the mayor, entered into the public record. Elena Webb read the apology at a press conference. She read it slowly, every word, into a bank of microphones while Marcus Ellison stood beside her. He was quiet during the press conference. Several reporters commented on it later. The stillness of him, the lack of visible triumph. One journalist described him as a man who had won a war and was still calculating the cost. Operation Ironclad in its original form was over. The months of surveillance, the undercover work, the relationship with Troy Maddox, all of it gone, burned by the hours in a holding cell. The FBI rebuilt the operation from a different angle, and while the Bureau's official position was that the new approach was viable, Marcus knew, and Okoro knew, and Riley Trenton knew that the version of the case they eventually brought to court was materially diminished from what it might have been. Troy Maddox was eventually arrested, but on lesser charges. He pleaded to a single count of distribution and received a sentence that, in Marcus's estimation, was roughly a fraction of what a fully executed Operation Ironclad would have delivered. That was the cost that never appeared in the settlement. The cost measured not in money, but in criminals who walked lighter than they should have because officers turned off their cameras that night. What happened to Caleb Harlan in the months and years that followed is the part of this story that people who believe in karma tell with a particular quiet satisfaction. His criminal trial began soon after. His defense attorney argued that the arrest had been a good faith mistake, that Officer Harlan had not known Marcus Ellison was a federal agent, and that the subsequent evidence room discrepancies were the result of administrative confusion rather than theft. The jury did not agree. The Southern Cross refrigeration footage played for the jury made "doesn't matter" the most important two words in the courtroom. The prosecution argued that those two words, spoken after Harlan had visually confirmed the credentials, removed any possibility of good faith error. This wasn't a mistake. This was a choice. Caleb Harlan was convicted on multiple counts: civil rights violation under color of law, evidence tampering, and theft of government property. He was sentenced to years in federal prison. Logan Sterling pleaded guilty to obstruction and received months. Nolan Greer, whose cooperation with federal investigators in exchange for a reduced charge had already burned every bridge he had in law enforcement, was convicted on conspiracy and corruption counts. He reported to a federal correctional facility. His retirement pension, the thing he had spent years carefully protecting by suppressing complaints, was forfeited. Vance Whitaker's case moved slower. The contracting fraud was complicated, the evidence circumstantial in places. But the U.S. Attorney's Office was patient, and patient is a word that means something specific when they use it. Whitaker eventually pleaded to a reduced charge, paid a fine, and was barred from public employment in the state of Georgia for years. Brock Donnelly, living on reduced income, gave one interview after his resignation in which he said that with the benefit of hindsight, he could see that standards had slipped. The interview was shared widely online, largely by people who found the phrase "standards had slipped" and inadequate accounting for years of documented racial bias in his department. He did not give another interview. The offer came over coffee in the kind of quiet corner booth at an Atlanta diner that people choose specifically because it is unlikely to be remembered. The administrator who made the offer, a decent man, Marcus thought, a man with genuinely good intentions and a genuine belief that what he was suggesting was a kindness, slid a folder across the table and described in careful and measured language a senior advisory position within the FBI's training division. Washington-based, prestigious, the kind of role that looked from the outside like a promotion, the kind of role that was from the inside a room with no windows. It was the Bureau's way of protecting one of its own by placing him somewhere safe, somewhere quiet, somewhere the next Caleb Harlan couldn't find him in a parking lot after dark. Marcus listened to the entire pitch without interrupting. He drank his coffee. He looked at the folder but did not open it. Then he thanked the man across from him, slid the folder back, and said with no drama and no hesitation, "I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I'm going back to the field." The administrator looked at him for a long moment. "Marcus, I'm going back to the field," he said again. And that was the end of that conversation. What Marcus did with the money is the part of this story that people close to him will tell you matters more than anything else, more than the settlement figure, more than the terminations, more than the footage from the Southern Cross cameras that made 2 words into a federal court exhibit. He kept enough to buy a house, a modest one, in a quiet neighborhood in southwest Atlanta with a backyard that backed up against a stand of Georgia pines and a front porch he had always told himself he would eventually make time to sit on. He bought it outright, no mortgage, because he had spent years living in rented apartments and motel rooms and undercover identities, and he wanted, for the first time in his adult life, something that was simply and permanently his. The rest of it, millions, he gave away. Not to charity in the abstract, distant sense of a check written to an institution. He gave it to something specific, something built, something that would function and fight and continue to exist after the news cycle moved on. Working alongside Elena Webb, who donated a significant portion of her own fee from the case, a decision that surprised everyone except those who knew her well, Marcus established the Harrow Fund. The name was deliberate and it was debated. More than one person in Marcus's circle suggested naming it something aspirational, something forward-looking, something that didn't carry the weight of a county that had put him in a cell. Marcus disagreed. He wanted the name to do something. He wanted every person who encountered it to ask what Harrow was, and then to have to sit with the answer. "Shame that doesn't change anything," he told Elena when they were finalizing the paperwork. "If this fund does its job, Harrow County spends the next stretch being known for 2 things, what it did and what it cost them. Both of those things need to live in the name." Elena had agreed. She had also pointed out, with the practical clarity that made her extraordinary at her work, that a fund named for a county's failure and attached to a multi-million-dollar settlement verdict would have no difficulty generating press coverage for its cases. She was right. She usually was. The Harrow Fund's stated mission was precise: legal representation for low-income residents of Georgia who had experienced police misconduct, with a particular focus on cases in which the internal complaint process had been used not to address wrongdoing, but to bury it. The focus on complaint suppression was intentional. It was the thing, more than the bad arrests, more than the individual officers, that Marcus had decided was the actual disease. Individual misconduct was a symptom. The machinery that made it invisible was the disease. In its first stretch, the fund took on cases. It won most of them, recovering millions in additional settlements for Georgia residents who had been filing complaints into the void for years. Several of those cases involved the same county, not Harrow, a different one, where an almost identical complaint suppression pattern had been operating invisible until the fund's investigators started pulling the records. The other cases were still active when the fund's first annual report was published. Elena Webb's note in the foreword of that report said in part, "We did not take the cases because we thought we would win them easily. We took them because they were right. The Harrow Fund does not select cases based on probability of victory. It selects them based on whether someone's rights were violated and whether they deserve to have someone stand beside them when they say so." Sandra Ellison joined the fund's advisory board soon after the settlement was announced. Her contribution was not ceremonial. She brought with her a methodology for complaint pattern analysis that she had refined over years of investigations, a methodology that became the fund's primary investigative framework for identifying systemic misconduct before cases went to court. The board met quarterly, but Sandra and Marcus talked more often than that. They had, in the way of people who have worked the same problem from different angles, developed an unusual mutual respect. "You ever regret going back to the field?" she asked him once over the phone during one of their irregular check-ins. "Every time I'm in a parking lot after dark," he said. And then the next morning, no. The letter from Karen Bledsoe arrived on a morning months after the settlement, almost exactly a year after the night in question. It was handwritten on plain paper and had been rewritten several times based on the faint erasure marks visible on certain lines. It was the letter of someone who had been trying to say something for a long time and had finally decided that the discomfort of saying it was less than the weight of staying silent. Bledsoe wrote that she thought about that night every single day. She wrote that she replayed the conversation in the hallway, the one at the cell door, and ran through every version of what she could have done differently. She could have made the call herself right there in the hallway, instead of taking the message to Greer. She could have pushed back harder when Greer dismissed it. She could have documented the request formally, instead of relying on a verbal exchange that left her word against the sergeant's. She wrote that she understood why she hadn't done those things. The weight of the hierarchy, the early stage of the job, the particular paralysis of being new enough to doubt yourself in every situation. But that understanding why hadn't made it easier to live with. She wrote that she hoped the small things she had tried to do in that hallway had meant something. Marcus read the letter twice. Then he sat at the kitchen table of the house in southwest Atlanta with Georgia sunshine coming through the window, and he wrote back. Handwritten pages. He told her that what she had done in that hallway was not a small thing. He told her that in every complex situation he had been involved in professionally, and there had been many across years of federal work, the determining moral variable was never the person with the most power or the clearest authority. It was always the person with the least of both who chose, in a moment that cost them something, to act as though doing right mattered more than doing safe. He told her that Greer had had the authority and the seniority and the institutional cover to do the right thing that night and had chosen not to. She had had almost none of those things and had chosen differently. That difference was not small. That difference was, in his view, the entire definition of character. He told her about the Harrow Fund. He told her about the cases. He told her that every single one of those cases had begun with someone deciding, against the weight of habit and hierarchy and the path of least resistance, that someone's rights were worth speaking about. He told her that the night had cost him something real and significant. Months of operational work, a case that should have put a man away for longer and instead delivered a fraction of that, sleep for a period, a particular kind of trust in the ordinary safety of ordinary situations, the kind of trust that, once punctured, takes longer to rebuild than any settlement can measure. And then he told her that it had also given him something, not in spite of what happened, not as a silver lining, which he found to be a fundamentally dishonest frame, but as a consequence of what he chose to do in the aftermath. The fund, the cases, the people who had had someone stand beside them in a proceeding that, without the fund, they would have faced alone. None of that existed without that night. He wasn't grateful for the night. He would never be grateful for the night. But he was clear-eyed about what it had produced, and being clear-eyed about what suffering produces, without sanitizing the suffering, without pretending the cost was worth it, was, he had come to believe, as close to wisdom as he had ever managed. He signed the letter the way he signed everything professional: Special Agent Marcus Ellison, FBI Atlanta Field Office. Then below that, he added a line he had never written on anything professional in his career: "Thank you for the hallway. It mattered more than you know." Here is what Marcus Ellison's story actually teaches us. Injustice rarely announces itself. It doesn't show up with a villain's theme music or obvious malice written across its face. It shows up as habit, as complacency, as a sergeant eating a sandwich while a man in a cell asks for a phone call. It shows up in boxes checked, cameras switched off, and complaints quietly filed and just as quietly buried. The Harrow County story is not unique, and that is precisely why it matters. Somewhere right now, in some department, in some county in this country, a clock is ticking. The question is whether the Karen Bledsoes in those departments will stop it before the FBI shows up, or whether the city will learn the price of complacency on a multi-million-dollar invoice. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something, if it made you think about accountability, about who protects the people that laws are supposed to protect, then do something with that feeling. Like this video so others can find it. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story that the world needs you to know about. These stories exist whether we tell them or not. But when we tell them loudly, together without looking away, something changes. Let's keep that.